Welcome back. Good to have you here. I'm Matthew. Today's story is about a couple who went on an anniversary hiking trip and took what turned out to be their last photo together. What they didn't account for was that climbing down a rock face above a 580-foot drop with no gear is a lot more forgiving than climbing back up. It was October 24th, 2015. The North Cascades in Washington state sit close to the Canadian border, and if you've never been up there, the best way I can describe it is that it doesn't really feel like the rest of Washington. The forest is dense, the rock is exposed, and the elevation climbs past 4,000 feet before you've had time to think about it. In October, it stops feeling like fall and starts feeling like something colder, and the weather up there moves faster than most people are ready for. Theron Gall was 34 and worked as a structural engineer out of Portland. Precise, detail-oriented at work, kind of guy who calculated exactly how much stress something could take before it failed. Outside of work though, when he got excited about something, that same careful thinking had a way of not showing up. He'd done some hiking before, weekend trips, moderate trails, nothing serious, and he'd always been fine, so his idea of what was manageable was based on a pretty limited track record. He'd been planning this trip for about 6 weeks before he even told Cleo about it. He'd seen a photo of the overlook online and decided immediately that was where he wanted to take her for their 5th anniversary. He researched the trail, booked the permit, sorted the gear. When he finally told her a week before they left, she was genuinely surprised. Cleo Gall was 31, a freelance graphic designer who worked mostly from home. She wasn't an outdoors person. She liked the idea of hiking more than the actual physical reality of it, but the way Theron described the trip made it sound like something worth doing. She trusted his judgment on the logistics completely. She went out and bought a film camera specifically for the trip because she wanted real photographs at the end of it, the kind you hold in your hand, not a camera roll on her phone she'd forget about in a month. They drove up from Portland on the morning of October 23rd, a Friday. The drive takes you north and then east into Washington, and somewhere along the way, the landscape just shifts. The trees get bigger, the road gets narrower, and there's that specific feeling of being further from everything than you're used to. Cleo had her camera out before they even got to the trailhead, shooting through the passenger window at the mountains coming into view. It was the first time she'd seen the Cascades up close. The mountains were new to her, and she was photographing before they even got out of the car. They stopped once for gas and food, got to the trailhead parking area mid-morning. The weather was clear, cold but manageable, mid-40s with no wind. Theron checked the forecast one more time before they lost signal. The cold front tracking in from the Pacific wasn't expected until late Saturday at the earliest. He figured they'd be well into their descent by then. They signed in, shouldered their packs, and started up. The first several miles were exactly what you'd want from a trip like this. Well-maintained trail, good visibility, that specific kind of quiet you only get when you're far enough from everything that the noise of regular life just stops. Cleo was photographing constantly. Frost on leaves, the way the trail curved through the trees. Theron's back as he walked ahead of her. She went through probably a third of her roll before they'd even hit the halfway point. Theron was setting a solid pace. They were talking, stopping occasionally to eat or look at something. The first part of that day was exactly what he'd hoped it would be when he planned it. They made camp that evening at a flat section of trail around 3,200 feet, well below the upper exposed section. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went behind the ridgeline, down into the mid-20s overnight, which is cold but not unusual for that elevation in late October. They had a decent tent, sleeping bags rated for the temperature, enough food. Cleo mentioned her feet were cold even inside her sleeping bag. Theron told her she'd warm up once she stopped moving. She did eventually, but it took longer than it should have. At some point she pulled out the camera and went through the shots she'd taken that day, holding it up in the low light of the tent. They were both tired and fell asleep without much conversation. The night was completely still, no wind, no sound, just the cold sitting on everything. Saturday morning, October 24th, they woke up to clear skies and temperatures that hadn't climbed much from overnight. Theron tried to get a signal on his phone to check the forecast update, but couldn't pull one from camp. He packed up without it. The morning looked fine, bright, still, the kind of mountain morning that makes you feel like the weather is on your side. He made coffee on the camp stove. They ate, packed up. Cleo's hands were stiff from the cold when she was breaking down the tent. She mentioned it. Theron told her they'd warm up once they got moving. That was true, mostly. Hiking generates enough body heat to compensate for a lot. But stiff, cold hands at the start of the day, at that elevation, in that terrain, is information. It's your body telling you something about the conditions. Neither of them read it that way. The plan for Saturday was to push up to the overlook, spend some time there, and then come back down to camp for one more night before hiking out Sunday. It was the most ambitious part of the trip. The upper section of the trail gains significant elevation quickly, and the terrain gets more exposed the higher you go. Theron had known this going in and had factored it into the plan. What he hadn't fully factored in was how different the upper section would feel compared to the lower trail they'd done the day before. Around mile 6, the trail's surface started changing. More exposed rock, less tree cover, and the temperature dropped a few degrees just from losing the shelter of the forest. The granite up there had a thin film of moisture on it from the overnight cold. Not dramatic, not something that jumps out at you visually, just a slight sheen on the surface that made it look like the rock was damp. Nothing that would have made either of them stop and think twice about it. The wind had started picking up too, not violently, just that steady, persistent cold that gets into your layers and sits there. Cleo pulled her hood up. Theron kept moving. Past mile 6, the trail narrowed considerably and the tree line dropped away almost completely. What replaced it was open granite, wide slabs of it running across the trail surface, broken up by patches of loose rock and that occasional shallow crack running perpendicular to the path. The exposure up there is a different thing entirely from the lower trail. There's nothing to break the wind, nothing to give you a sense of scale or shelter, just the rock and the sky and the ridgeline ahead of you. The trail itself was still visible, but it had stopped being a maintained path and started being more of a suggested route across open terrain. At that elevation in late October, the light was already sitting low, and the shadows the ridgeline threw across the rock made it harder to read the surface texture accurately from a distance. There was a closure sign posted on the upper section of the trail. A ranger had put it up 2 days earlier after flagging hazardous surface conditions on the exposed rock faces above 4,000 feet. It wasn't a permanent closure, wasn't even a particularly aggressive warning, just a marker that said conditions ahead were dangerous and to turn back. Theron saw it. That part's not ambiguous. One of the photographs recovered from Cleo's camera later includes the sign visible in the background, with Theron walking past it. He looked at it, decided it was probably one of those seasonal liability postings that gets put up as a precaution and doesn't reflect what's actually up there, and kept walking. He'd seen signs like that on other trails before, and they'd always been fine. Cleo followed him past it without stopping. I think about that sign a lot when I go back through this case. Not because it would have definitely changed anything. People ignore trail warnings all the time and make it back fine. But it was put up specifically because of conditions on the exact type of terrain they were about to be on. It wasn't a generic seasonal posting. It was current, it was specific, and it was accurate. And it didn't matter because Theron had already decided what kind of sign it was before he read it. By the time they got into the upper section, the wind had picked up further. Cleo mentioned her hands were going numb through her gloves. She had liner gloves under a shell, which should have been enough, but the wind was cutting through more than she'd expected. Theron suggested they push to the overlook, maybe another 20 minutes out, take their photos, eat something warm, and then head back down. They were already most of the way there. Turning back at that point felt like giving up right before the payoff. And honestly, that logic is hard to argue with when you're standing in it. You've already done the hard part. The thing you came for is right there, so you keep going. They reached the main overlook at around 2:30 in the afternoon. It's a wide granite shelf that juts out over the valley with a completely unobstructed view. Nothing between you and the horizon except open air and the ridgelines of the range going out in every direction. At that time of day, that time of year, with the light coming in low from the southwest, it would have been genuinely breathtaking. Cleo started working immediately, moving around the shelf, framing shots, figuring out angles. She took several frames just of the view itself before she even thought about setting up a shot of the two of them. Theron dropped his pack, ate something, walked around the perimeter of the shelf. He was happy. This was exactly what he'd been picturing when he planned the trip. While Theron was walking the edge of the shelf, Cleo set her sketchbook on a flat rock and did a rough pencil outline of the ridgeline across from them. Just the basic shapes, something to work from later. She was still sketching when Theron walked to the far edge and looked down. About 18 to 20 feet below the main overlook, there was a secondary ledge, narrower, maybe 5 feet wide, but it stuck out further over the drop, and from that position, background would have been nothing but open sky and valley. No rock shelf, no trail, no context that you were standing on a mountain at all. Just the two of them and that view stretching out behind them. Theron stood there, looking at it for a minute. Then he called Cleo over. She looked down at it. Her first reaction was no, not a dramatic refusal, just a quiet, instinctive hesitation. 5 feet of rock jutting out over a very long drop is not something most people look at and immediately think, yeah, let's go down there. She asked him how they'd even get down there. He pointed out the rock face between the two ledges, the angle of it, the cracks and features in the surface, the places where you could get your hands and feet. It wasn't vertical, more like a steep angled scramble, maybe 55 to 60 degrees, with enough texture in the rock to work with. He told her it looked totally doable. He'd go first, talk her through every step, and if it felt sketchy at any point, they'd stop and come back up. She stood there for a moment, looked at the ledge below one more time, then at the rock face, and something in her expression settled. Not excitement exactly, more like she'd made a decision and was committing to it. She closed the sketchbook, put it back in her pack, transferred the film camera from her pack to her jacket pocket, and set the pack down on the main overlook. Theron spent a minute at the top of the rock face before starting down, testing a couple of holds from a standing position, checking the angle of the first few moves. Then he went over the edge and started working his way down, moving deliberately, calling out each hold as he found it. The rock had enough features to work with. Horizontal cracks at regular intervals, a few wider ledges that gave solid footing. It wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. Cleo followed once he reached the bottom, moving slower than he had, pausing at each move before committing to it. The hardest section was about halfway down, where the crack system thinned out, and the holds got smaller, but she got through it. It took them about 10 minutes total to reach the lower ledge. They made it without any real issues. When they both got their feet on the lower ledge and looked out at the view from that position, Cleo actually laughed. Because Theron had been right, it was a completely different perspective from down there. The valley opened up in a way it hadn't from the main overlook. The drop below them was immediate and total, and that made the view feel enormous in a way that's hard to describe. She understood immediately why he'd wanted to come. Down here, she spent a few minutes just standing at the edge, looking out. Theron finished the last of his food, drank some water, walked the 5-foot width of the ledge a couple of times. The wind was more noticeable down there. The ledge was more exposed than the main overlook, less sheltered by the surrounding rock, and it came at them steadily from the northwest. Cleo pulled the film camera out of her jacket pocket and spent some time just holding it, looking out at the valley, deciding what she wanted to capture. She took a few frames of the view from that position, the valley floor far below, the ridgelines going out in both directions, the shadow line where the sun was already starting to drop behind the western ridge. Then she started looking for somewhere to prop the camera for the two of them. She found a flat section of rock near the back of the ledge, set the camera on it, framed the shot. She adjusted the angle a couple of times, walked back to where Theron was standing to check the framing from his position, went back and adjusted again. She set the self-timer. They stood at the edge together, arms around each other, facing out over the valley. The shutter fired. It is a perfect photograph. They stood there for another few minutes after that, just looking, not talking much. The kind of silence that happens when you're somewhere genuinely beautiful, and you both know it, and there's nothing useful to say about it. At some point, Theron said they should start heading back up. The light was going to start dropping in another hour or so, and he wanted to be off the upper section before that happened. Cleo took one more look at the valley, then they turned around to face the rock face. It was 2:55 in the afternoon. The rock face they'd come down was north-facing and had been in shade for most of the day. From above, when Theron had been scoping it out, he'd been looking at it in the context of the surrounding rock, some of which was getting afternoon sun, some of which looked dry and solid. What he hadn't fully accounted for was that the shaded wall they actually needed to climb was holding significantly more cold and moisture than the surfaces around it. The difference between the way it felt going down and the way it felt going up wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like suddenly climbing a different surface. It was subtler than that, just slightly less grip than you expected on each hold. Just slightly more effort required to feel secure. The kind of difference that's easy to dismiss as nerves or fatigue rather than an actual change in conditions. Theron put his hands on the wall and tested the first 2 holds from the ledge before starting up, the same thing he'd done at the top on the way down. They felt solid enough. He started climbing. Same approach as the descent. Methodical, not rushing, calling out holds as he found them. He made it about 12 feet up, more than halfway, before his left boot slipped off a foothold. Not a catastrophic thing on its own. His hands were already on the wall and he grabbed tighter, caught himself, held his position. He stayed still for a moment, pressed against the rock face, getting his breathing back under control. Cleo was watching from the ledge below. Here's the thing about hands that have been cold for an hour. You stop noticing it after a while because it becomes the baseline. It's just how your hands feel, so your brain stops flagging it as a problem. What's actually happening is that the cold is steadily reducing your grip strength and your dexterity in ways that don't feel dramatic from the inside, but are very real. Theron's hands had been cold since before they even reached the overlook. By the time he was 12 feet up that rock face, his grip was meaningfully weaker than it had been on the way down, and he almost certainly didn't know that. He steadied himself, found his footing again, took a breath, reached up for the next handhold. A ledge of granite about 6 inches wide, sitting just above his eye line, looked completely solid. Looked like it had been part of that rock face for 1,000 years. It came off in his hand. This happens in alpine rock environments more than people realize. The freeze-thaw cycle works on the surface layer of granite over time. Water gets into microfractures, freezes, expands, and slowly separates sections of rock from the face beneath them. From the outside, those sections look completely integrated. They look like the mountain, but underneath, the connection is almost nothing. Technical climbers learn early to test every single hold before weighting it. Every time, no exceptions, because the ones that look the most permanent are sometimes the ones that are barely there. Theron didn't know that. He reached for the hold, came away, and suddenly there was nothing in his hands and nothing under his feet, and he was coming off the wall. He didn't fall past the lower ledge cleanly. He hit it on the way down, the left side of his body taking the impact. The force of it enough to fracture his leg and several ribs on contact. The momentum didn't stop there. It carried him over the edge of the lower ledge and into open air, 580 feet, to the boulder field below. Cleo was standing on the ledge, watching him climb. What happens in the next few minutes is reconstructed entirely from physical evidence, because there was no one else there to see it. What the evidence tells us is that she went for the rock face almost immediately after he fell. There was no extended period of time on the ledge. There was no indication she waited. The marks on the wall suggest she went for it almost right away. Whether it was panic, whether it was the instinct to get to him, whether some part of her brain hadn't fully processed what she just watched and was operating on the assumption that she needed to move. We don't know. What we know is that she went for the wall. She made it about 4 or 5 feet up before her hands gave out on the same moisture-slicked surface that had taken Theron off. She came off the wall fast. No intermediate catch, no partial recovery. Her fall took her straight over the edge of the ledge. The film camera sat on the lower ledge, completely undisturbed, for the next 17 hours. There was nobody else up there. The main overlook was empty. The lower trail near the boulder field at the base of that section sees almost no traffic in late October, and the terrain between the overlook and the valley floor is not the kind of place anyone passes through casually. There was no one to hear anything, no one to see anything. The boulder field where they landed is technically visible from certain points on the lower trail, but you'd have to be specifically looking for something to notice anything from that distance, and nobody was. Theron and Cleo had a 2-night permit. Nobody expected them back until Sunday evening. That's the whole point of a backcountry trip. You're out of contact, you're on your own schedule, and the people back home know that and respect it. So when they didn't show up Sunday night, there was already a built-in gap before anyone started asking questions. A family member Theron had left the trip details with before they left Portland waited until well past the time they should have been back before making a call. A search was put together that evening, but the terrain and the fading light meant teams couldn't safely get into the upper section until first light Monday morning. The lower sections were checked Sunday night and came up empty, which told the search teams they needed to go higher. It was a slow process. The upper trail is not easy terrain to move through quickly in the dark, and the search teams had no specific location to work from yet, just a general area and a missing persons report. By the time first light came on Monday, they had a better plan, but it had already been roughly 15 hours since Theron and Cleo had gone over that ledge. A group of hikers reached the main overlook Monday morning and spotted the film camera sitting on the lower ledge below. They also noticed the rock face, a section of the surface that looked disturbed, a missing chunk of granite, scuff marks on the wall where boots had lost traction. They flagged it immediately. Search teams were redirected toward the boulder field. Theron and Cleo were both recovered from the boulder field by early Monday afternoon. Theron was found about 30 feet from the base of the rock face. Cleo was 18 feet from him. Cleo's pack was still sitting on the main overlook where she'd left it before climbing down. Her sketchbook was inside it, open to the last page she'd been working on. A rough pencil sketch of the ridgeline across from the overlook, just the basic shapes, started while Theron was walking the edge of the shelf before he spotted the lower ledge, unfinished. She never came back up to add anything to it. The recovery team sent someone down to the lower ledge with proper equipment, ropes, harness, crampons, to retrieve the camera. The full roll was developed, 24 exposures. The first 23 are from throughout the day, the trailhead parking area, forest, frost on leaves, Theron at various points on the trail, and one frame that includes the closure sign in the background, with Theron walking past it. The 24th frame is the two of them on the lower ledge, standing at the edge, arms around each other, the valley behind them. Cleo was laughing. Theron is looking at her instead of the camera. The coroner ruled both deaths accidental. Cause of death for both was blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from significant elevation. Theron's injuries included additional impact trauma from striking the lower ledge before going over, fractures to the left leg, and multiple ribs consistent with that intermediate impact. Cleo's injuries were consistent with a direct fall from the lower ledge to the boulder field with no intermediate contact. No signs of third-party involvement. The granite flake that failed under Theron's grip was recovered, photographed, and documented by the recovery team. A section of surface rock, roughly the size of a hardcover book, the underside of it showing almost no real attachment to the face beneath it. Theron's GPS watch logged their position on the lower ledge at 2:41 p.m. on October the 24th. That was the last recorded data point before the signal went static. The trail closure they'd walked past had been posted specifically because of hazardous surface conditions on the upper rock faces. The lower ledge Theron climbed down to wasn't a designated feature, wasn't on any trail map, and had no documented history of prior use. The case was closed. No further investigation was opened.